I forgot. Yeah.
Somebody left their microphone on.
I forgot we were on the
Is it cold in Tahoka?
You didn't mute.
Look like a bunch of little Eskimos down there shaking and shivering in the cold.
Y'all, that's the thing, y'all talk so
Yes. Yes.
We need to talk to the school about turning the heat on for you. See if we can get this thing going here. Okay, we're moving into exam 2 time on Friday, and we're going to do the last little step we have to take care of. It's kind of a major step today, and we'll finish it off on Wednesday talking about President Andrew Jackson. See which one I like the most. Let's try this one.
For some reason, my computer isn't charging.
Is there no power? Is the power pulled out of on the wall? Is it plugged in?
Yeah.
There he is, Andrew Jackson. Let's get it up on the screen so you guys can see him. Seventh President of the United States. Did a lot of interesting things. We'll start as soon as I see some other classes popping up there. There's Hale Center. And once again, post camera still broken. Help is coming, post. Can you hear me down there? Speak. Your camera may be broken, but your microphone should be working. Okay, let's get this show on the road. We've got some ground to cover. Get your pencil sharpened. Let's go. This fellow was born before the American Revolution. He was just a kid during the Revolution. His father died before he was born. We're not really sure what state he was born in. I think it was in the Carolinas, but not absolutely sure. He lived in the Carolinas for the early part of his life, and then moved out into Tennessee in his adulthood. He had some prejudices from early life. He didn't like Indians. I think that had to do with fighting them at different places as a youngster. He didn't like banks. I think that had to do with fighting them as a young man. And he didn't like the British. And I think that had to do with the fact that they beat him up when he was a kid because he was taking messages for the Patriots as a young boy. His mother died of cholera when he was 14 years old during the Revolution. She'd been serving as a nurse for American prisoners of war held by the British. And he blamed the British for the conditions in the prison camp, spreading cholera and killing his mom. So he's kind of on his own from that point on. And he didn't tread water, and he didn't spend a lot of time feeling sorry for himself. He was self-taught to a large extent. He passed the South Carolina bar exam. That's the exam you take in order to be allowed to practice law. He passed it at the age of 20. So it was a little bit different then than it is now, but still, that was quite an accomplishment. Around 1791, he married the daughter of the lady that owned the boarding house he lived in. Her name was Rachel Robards. Well, Rachel Donaldson was her maiden name. She was divorced from a fellow named Robards. But sometime in 1794, they discovered that that divorce wasn't final, and they were both pretty straight-laced people, and they were shocked by it, and they quickly got the paperwork done and remarried again. The only reason we even care about that, that's kind of their business, not ours. Hang on for a sec, I gotta fix something here. Okay, adjust the light there. Someone's going to use it against him. Eventually, he's going to do things like investing in land. He's going to practice law and make a living doing that. But in 1796, he'll be elected to Congress as soon as Tennessee becomes a state. And he proved himself to be what you call an Anglophobe. That's somebody that hates England. And a Francophile, that's somebody that likes France. In 1797, he was elected to the Senate, but I think he was underage to be elected to the Senate. And he resigned and then was elected to the Tennessee Supreme Court at a very young and tender age. In 1802, he became commander of the Tennessee militia. I think that involved a fist fight to see who got the job. He tended to do some fist fights from time to time. Of course, we know about his battle at Horseshoe Bend during the War of 1812 in March of 1814. And we know about the Battle of New Orleans, which made him a national hero. By that time, he'd already become a major general in the National Army. We know about his adventure where he went charging after the Indians into Florida, where John Quincy Adams told the president, don't fire him, don't punish him for doing it. He did something to help me, not intentionally maybe, but it helps me negotiate with the Spanish. In 1824, of course, he ran against John Quincy Adams and a whole bevy of other hopefuls. He won the popular vote, but he didn't win enough electoral votes, and with the help of Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams won the congressional tiebreaker, or whatever you want to call it, the runoff. He called that election of 1824 a corrupt bargain. Look at the count. You can see the numbers there. John Quincy Adams got 113,000 odd popular votes, and Andrew Jackson got 151,000 odd popular votes. Tariff of Abominations was passed just before he ran for president in 1828. That was that tariff that South Carolina hated. It was kind of a plot done by John C. Calhoun to guarantee that John Quincy Adams wouldn't win the election. It backfired on John C. Calhoun, who had to write that South Carolina exposition and protest. Put that up there so you can see it, just so you remember that. That was in protest of a tariff that John C. Calhoun actually wanted written because he was sure that John Quincy Adams would have to veto it, and that would make it impossible for him to win the presidency, but in fact John Quincy Adams signed it. He still lost the presidency. Andrew Jackson didn't need any help with that election. That's what the election of 1828 looked like in terms of Jackson's votes are all the purple votes on that slide. Adams won where all the green votes are. He was not a common man, but he was the president of the common man. And the election of Andrew Jackson was kind of another kind of revolution. What have we talked about now? We talked about the American Revolution, then we talked about the election of 1800 being the Second American Revolution because it was a change of party in control. Then we talked about the Industrial Revolution. I guess you could call that the Third American Revolution. So this must be the Fourth American Revolution. I'm not sure any book says that. But what we're seeing is the beginnings of all, or the beginnings of a large percentage of white American males getting the vote. Suffrage is expanding. So the common man's becoming more and more important in the vote. And Andrew Jackson was popular with the common man. You notice I had to slow down and think about how to say that. Women didn't have the vote. People of other races didn't have the vote. American Indians weren't even citizens. So it's kind of hard to say the total common man, but more that way anyway. There's old John C. Calhoun. That's one of the later pictures of him. It even gets worse than that later on. One of the things in his background that he's going to regret is that when he was Secretary of War, he was very critical of Andrew Jackson doing that invasion into Spanish territory and suggested that Jackson should be punished. And he wrote that down and sent it to President Monroe. And that little note is going to be found eventually. Secretary of State, right up front, is Martin Van Buren. He was a U.S. Senator from New York. Later on, he became ran for governor of New York and won the election, but then was appointed Secretary of State. He's one of the people who was really important in getting Andrew Jackson elected because he swung the entire vote for the state of New York. He was also known to be kind of a moderating influence. Sometimes Andrew Jackson kind of did impulsive things, and Martin Van Buren helped kind of slow that down. John Eaton becomes his Secretary of War. John Eaton was a lawyer from Andrew Jackson's home state. He supported Andrew Jackson throughout his political career, and he was his aide while Jackson was campaigning against the Indians and also when he was leading the Battle of New Orleans. Lewis Cass later on will become the Secretary of War. We'll talk about him. He's the guy that came up with the idea of popular sovereignty, and we'll talk about that. Secretaries of the Treasury, look at all of them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, there was one more, too. And we'll talk about why several of them left office. That's kind of his entire cabinet. Look at the Secretaries of Treasury. The one that I don't have on the slide above is Levi Woodbury. He'll be Secretary of the Treasury at the end of Jackson's presidency. Jackson also had a bunch of friends in town. Now, he didn't start out this way. I guess he always kind of had them around. But people started calling them the kitchen cabinet. And a lot of people didn't like the kitchen cabinet because they thought Jackson talked more to them than he talked to his real cabinet. Notice two of them are newspapermen. Jackson understood the value of news coverage. One of them, his nephew, his wife's nephew. One of them was one of his business partners. In fact, the two of them were the guys that bought most of the land on which Nashville, Tennessee now stands. Then one of them, only one of them, was a member of his regular cabinet too. And that was a fellow named Roger B. Taney, who becomes his Attorney General, and later on he'll serve in other positions for him too, briefly. Here's what Andrew Jackson wanted to do. And you should kind of understand why. He hated banks, and he didn't like the notion of a national bank. And he thought it was bad for the country. It wasn't just a personal thing. He wanted to get rid of the Electoral College. That was a little bit more personal. He thought the Electoral College was why he didn't get elected president in 1824. He hated being in debt, and he wanted the country out of debt, so he's going to get rid of the national debt. He didn't like the Indians. He didn't like Indian problems. He had this idea of moving the Indians out west of the Mississippi somewhere where they wouldn't bother other people east of the Mississippi. He also wanted to gain respect for the United States overseas. We were still considered to be a second-rate country, even though we'd whooped up on the British twice. He wanted us to be able to do business freely all over the world, including the Caribbean, the West Indies. And the British kind of muscled us out of there. He wanted special treaties with all the big countries, all the wealthy countries. You call them most favored nation treaties. A most favored nation treaty is a bilateral treaty. It's just between two countries, and they guarantee each other that if they give any other country a really good deal about something, they'll give their most favored nation buddy at least as good a deal. And finally, a lot of countries owed us money, at least on paper, because of things like the quasi-war with France and some of the revolutions against the Spanish. We lost commercial ships, and he's determined he's going to collect the money for those losses. When we're done with his presidency, it will be really interesting to look at his report card and see how much of this he's done. Okay, he is a president for whom the issues are noticed, or probably most people know more about that than they know about what he achieved. Because he did achieve a lot as president, but he was kind of an imperial president in a way. The first one is something called the spoils system. There's an old saying, to the victor belong the spoils. You know, old armies didn't tend to pay their soldiers very much, but when they conquered the enemy, they'd be allowed to pillage, rape, and steal wherever they went. That was their salary. They called that the spoils of war. And politically, the spoils of war mean when you get elected, you do nice things for the people that helped you get elected. Doesn't matter if they can really do the job you're going to give them. It doesn't matter what their character is. It doesn't matter how much public service they've done, as long as they've helped you out. And a lot of people accuse Andrew Jackson, in large part wrongly, of starting the spoils system. The spoils system existed from the time we first had an elected president. But Andrew Jackson did believe in rotating people in and out of office, even from his own party, because he noticed, and we don't talk about it a lot, he noticed corruption in the post office, he noticed corruption in the Treasury Department, he noticed a lot of corruption in the parts of the armed forces like the Navy where they were procuring new equipment. There were a lot of bribes changing hands about that. And he is going to, throughout his presidency, do his best to get rid of that corruption. And for that reason, you're going to see a lot of people either fired or rotated out of office. But the people that didn't like him said it was all the spoils system. Two people that helped him, remember Martin Van Buren, he got to be Secretary of State. A fellow named Sam Swartwout, who helped him get elected, helped Martin Van Buren turn the vote out for him up in New York, got to be the collector for the Port of New York, which meant all the money in tariffs of incoming cargo went through his hands, and his hands were a little bit sticky. In fact, he ripped the federal government off for about $2 million, which was big bucks back then. I mean, if I had $2 million, it'd be big bucks now, but back then that was a lot of money. And all the way through Jackson's 2 terms of office, this guy is going to be raking this cash in, and at one point where people start paying attention to it a little bit more carefully, he's going to take off for Europe. It's just a health trip, of course. He's going to the spas. Caused a lot of embarrassment for Andrew Jackson. These are all Andrew Jackson cartoons. That's one riding a giant pig with dollar signs all over him, labeled "To the victor belong the spoils." Another one is Andrew Jackson the First, King Andrew. Okay, there are 4 issues I want you to remember about Andrew Jackson. Some of them are intertwined, and I'm going to go through each issue and we'll discuss it, and then we'll go back kind of to the beginning, because they all happened at the same time, all through the early 4 years of his first term anyway in office. First of all, even before we talk about that, Andrew Jackson was stricken by tragedy before he became president. After he was elected, but before he went into office, one of the things that his opposition had been doing is scraping at that story about his wife and him not being legally married when they moved in with each other, which is a big no-no back then. I'd like to say it's still a no-no, but I see a lot of people smiling at me. At any rate, they smeared him in the newspapers. They smeared Andrew Jackson and his wife in the newspapers, or did their best to. And under that stress and all that, his wife started developing heart problems. And in December of 1828, she suddenly fell in the kitchen and she died in his arms of a massive heart attack. And Andrew Jackson he was so distraught that he had to be peeled away from her in order for the doctors and the undertaker to take her away. And of course he blamed the people that were smearing them in the newspapers for embarrassing her and causing that kind of pressure. So all of the time that he's president, or most of the time, her niece, Emily Donaldson, will be the hostess in the White House when he has events there. And Emily's husband is a member of his kitchen cabinet that I mentioned before. His vice president, of course, will be John C. Calhoun, who brought along a wife, Floride, who will figure in this next problem. The Secretary of War is a fellow named John Eaton. He was a senator. He married a young lady named Margaret O'Neill. Can't remember what her married name was. She was not a divorcee, she was a widower. The story is that her husband died of some kind of an accident at sea. A lot of people say he committed suicide because he knew his wife was messing around with Senator John Eaton. At any rate, as soon as he died, John Eaton married Margaret Eaton. Everyone called her Peggy, nickname for Margaret. And everybody remembered that she was the daughter of a tavern owner. And a lot of the ladies in the presidency and the executive branch considered her a lowlife. And the problem with this is, remember, Andrew Jackson had just lost his wife because people had been smearing her. And what happened in his cabinet was that John and Margaret Eaton were not welcome to any receptions or anything because of the wife. And I guess the ringleader of that was Floride Calhoun. But Emily Donaldson was that way too. They just couldn't be lowered to talk to Peggy Eaton. And as a result of that, Andrew Jackson called all of the members of his cabinet together and said, "Get in control of your wives. You're disrupting the work we're doing here." The only good guy in the whole act was Martin Van Buren. Why? Because he wasn't married. Because, of course, we know that the cabinet members weren't able to control their wives. Eventually, by 1832, Andrew Jackson will have fired his entire cabinet over this issue. His entire cabinet. A couple of them resigned before he could fire them. Some of them he had to fire. Martin Van Buren came to him and said, he hadn't fired him yet. Martin Van Buren came to him, the Secretary of State, and said, I should resign too, just to have the appearance of being fair. So he did so. And Andrew Jackson said, okay, you go be my ambassador in England. Martin Van Buren didn't mind that. That's a cartoon about all the rats leaving the sinking ship, I guess. All the faces are faces of people that were in his cabinet. Whoops, you can see that. There it is. There's a picture of the people involved in the Petticoat affair. Actually, Martin Van Buren wasn't involved in it, but he made big points to the president because he was kind to Peggy O'Neill. States' rights and nullification. Next big issue. So we've had the Petticoat affair. That's number one. Number two, states' right and nullification. Remember, John C. Calhoun had run down to South Carolina to write the South Carolina Exposition in protest after he and his buddies got the Tariff of Abominations passed in Congress. And the ugly word was nullification. And this piece of paper said that South Carolina had the right to nullify. Now, up until this point, John C. Calhoun has been a supporter of Andrew Jackson. But as time goes by, different things are going to happen, and they're going to become less and less friends, and eventually they're going to become enemies. The issue over Florida Calhoun dissing Peggy O'Neill, that hurt their relationship. But there are a lot of other things that hurt the relationship. And John C. Calhoun starts becoming more and more a states' rights kind of guy, and Andrew Jackson starts becoming more and more a strong central government kind of guy. The nullification crisis starts early on in a debate in Congress in January of 1830. So by that time, the president has been in office for, well, ever since March anyway. So less than 6 months. Robert Y. Hayne of South Carolina and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts are debating on whether or not the federal government should be selling Western lands. The people from Massachusetts didn't want the federal government expanding the country to the west because they didn't want to lose population and votes and that sort of thing. Whereas the Southerners wanted to expand, they needed more land for agriculture. This argument, though, after a few days of debate, is going to kind of change. And before long, Robert Hayne is saying, you're just arguing this for your own welfare and not for the overall welfare of the whole country. And we suddenly start seeing a states' rights sort of argument. Robert Hayne is a states' rights guy. Daniel Webster is more for strong central government. Really, Robert Hayne won the argument in Congress. I mean, he won the debate. But Daniel Webster's last speech drew a lot of public attention. It was a very dramatic speech, and it kind of made his name for him. I'm not going to read it to you, except the very last line. Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. All has to do with something else that happened. That was January of 1830. In April of 1830, they have a Jefferson Day. They had that every year, where all these so-called Democratic Republicans would get together to celebrate the life of Thomas Jefferson. And there were toasts drunk at this party. The two most important ones, one by three most important. Senator Robert Hayne raised his glass and toasted the union of the states and the sovereignty of the states. And Andrew Jackson couldn't let that slide by. So after they drank that glass, he stood up and toasted, our federal union, it must be preserved. people all realized that this was turning into an argument. And then Vice President Calhoun got up, the Union, next to our liberty, the most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and burden of the Union. Everybody in the room and everybody in the newspapers and all knew that that was kind of like two people slapping each other in the face. And once again, that split between Calhoun and Andrew Jackson is spreading, and it's going to keep on widening. In 1830, remember the letter that I said Calhoun wrote about Andrew Jackson when he went into Indian territory or Spanish territory down south? Andrew Jackson finds the letter. And then there's an argument because Andrew Jackson says he got a letter passed to him personally, privately from President Monroe, telling him to do what he actually did. Everyone else denied that the letter existed. That will be something that Andrew Jackson argues about for the rest of his life. That happens in May. The split between Jackson and John C. Calhoun is now getting really wide. Then, after all the cabinet had resigned and Martin Van Buren had already been sent over to England to be ambassador while Congress was out of session, when Congress came back into session, they would have to confirm the appointment as ambassador. And the vote was a tie, a 50-50 tie. Who breaks a tie in Congress? Or, I mean, in the, this is the Senate doing this. Who breaks a tie in the Senate? You ought to know that because it's very significant right now. Who breaks a tie in the Senate? Anybody? Come on, guys. Right now, we're complaining about that because of the tie in the Senate. We have 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. Who gets to break the tie if they disagree?
The Vice President?
Yes. And guess who the Vice President was? John C. Calhoun. And guess what he did? He voted not to confirm Martin Van Buren as ambassador to England. That was the President's appointment, right? So forget about being friends from that point on. Senator Benton from Missouri told Calhoun, you've broken a minister, but you've made a new vice president because you're not going to be vice president anymore. John Tyler was a senator from Virginia, and he told a friend that Van Buren is elevated by the silly thing of rejecting him. And boy, was that right. Okay. Election of 1832. Jackson and Van Buren are going to be the candidates. John C. Calhoun is out. They're going to run against Henry Clay and John Sargent, but Andrew Jackson is a shoo-in to win this. Okay, that's the second crisis. Well, that at least ends the Jackson and Van Buren, and the Jackson and John C. Calhoun feud to some extent. But in November of 1832, by the way, well, we'll get there when we get there. The state of South Carolina voted to nullify the tariff of abominations, the tariff of 1828, and also they nullified a more recent tariff of 1832, which Calhoun and others had tried to make the tariff of 1828 not so bad. They vetoed both of them. South Carolina was split about 60-40, for or against that tariff, and for and against nullification. A lot of people in South Carolina didn't want to nullify a federal law because they knew it would cause trouble for their state. But they were having really, really terrible economic problems, and there was a lot of bitterness there. Andrew Jackson fires right back in December, on the 10th of December, 1832. And he tells them that their nullification is inconsistent with every principle on which the Constitution was founded and destructive of the Union. It's not over yet. Somebody passes through the President's office, actually this happened a little bit earlier, on his way to South Carolina, said, "Do you have any messages for your friends down there, Mr. President?" Because he still had supporters down there. He said, "Give my compliments to my friends in your state and say to them, if a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct upon the first tree I can reach." Those are fairly strong words. He also gets information that the state of South Carolina may be trying to subvert American officers that are posted in the bases down in Charleston. So he tells his Secretary of War, start rotating people in and out. And then he gets news that maybe South Carolina is going to try and take over the federal forts down there using their militia. So be ready to respond to that. He had a lot of friends down there telling him what was going on. Winfield Scott's eventually going to be dispatched. He's going to go down to South Carolina, down to Charleston Harbor, and he's going to reinforce some of the forts down there. But he's a smart man, and he's going to be very, very careful not to antagonize the people there. It's his job just to be there at the orders of the President. So he's brought naval ships down there, and he's got soldiers. In fact, at some point in this big dispute, there's a fire in Charleston, and Winfield Scott brings the soldiers in to help put the fire out and wins the goodwill of most of the people in the town. And yet the South Carolina legislature is holding fast with this ordinance of nullification, which is supposed to go into effect on the first day of February 1833, nullifying that tariff law. So we're in December, 10 December. What else is going to happen? We're going to get a compromise, but I should add to you that before December's over, on about the 28th of December, John C. Calhoun, who knows he's not going to be president after next March, quits his job, goes to South Carolina, runs for senator, and gets the job of senator in South Carolina. So now he's going to be in a slightly more powerful position to argue against what the president's doing. But Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun are going to work out a compromise tariff. A tariff arrangement in which they agree that they're going to lower the tariff gradually over a period of years. At the same time, though, Congress is going to pass a bill authorizing the president to use force on South Carolina if they try and break the law. Both of these bills will be signed into law at about the same time. So now the president's got the authority to use his army if anyone breaks the law, and they're going to change how the tax is collected to make it more difficult to break the law. Of course, Calhoun's gone, and those slides out of order. And there's the great compromiser, Henry Clay. He comes up with this idea. He does not like Andrew Jackson, but he doesn't want South Carolina doing this either. And he works together with, I think, Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun in the Senate to come up with a compromise. And as soon as South Carolina receives that compromise, they're going to accept it quickly with a great deal of relief, because now all that Union or that federal army is down there, and they're very uncomfortable about it. Plus about half the people of South Carolina didn't want to get in this whole brouhaha to start with. Okay, so that's one, petticoat affair. Two, the Jackson, and you see how the Jackson and Calhoun thing carries on to something else. So petticoat affair, Jackson-Calhoun feud, the nullification crisis. I got another one, Indian removal. Jackson advocated Indian removal long before he became president. And we passed an Indian Removal Act in 1830. Now, right about the same time, we'd already had the Black Hawk Indian War up in Indiana Territory. Winfield Scott had been sent out to take command of that, but the local militia and people like that had settled most of everything by the time he got there. And as a result of the Black Hawk War, Congress is going to put through this Indian Removal Act, which authorizes the president to negotiate with the tribes to buy their property and to move them and to use money to buy property for them out west of the Mississippi. Jackson doesn't think the federal government or his own people are pushing hard enough, and he's going to keep pushing them to push the Indians harder. Now, in 1828, Georgia had passed a law. They want the Cherokee Indians' land. It's good land. It's rich soil. It's also filled with valuable minerals. The Cherokee Indians were the only thing different from them and any white people was that they had slightly different colored skin. They lived in houses. They believed in property. They had their own language. They had their own school system. But Georgia had decided they wanted that land by hook or by crook. And so the first thing they did was pass a law to put the state in control of Indian reservations. The point here is that normally Indian reservations or Indian lands were viewed as federal issues, not state issues. The Cherokees, not being the kind of people who wanted to go on the warpath or get involved in a war, had a lot of supporters in Congress, especially in the National Republican Party. Henry Clay, Theodore Frelinghuysen, Daniel Webster, Ambrose Spencer in the House of Representatives, Davy Crockett in the House of Representatives. They all supported the Indians, which is one reason that Davy Crockett and Andrew Jackson split, because they had been friends. And these people all tell the Cherokees, let's not do anything violent, let's take it to the courts. And it goes to the Supreme Court in 1830. The case is Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And the Supreme Court's going to say, you're not really an independent nation, and you have no standing before this court. You're not citizens. So we can't do anything to help you. And Georgia cheers, you know, they've won this battle. But they're not done yet. In 1832, Georgia makes the mistake of arresting a couple of people from up in Massachusetts who've come down to the Indian reservation to help them with things like law and higher education. They arrested these gentlemen because they went onto the Indian reservation without a state permit. And it goes to the Supreme Court. And the court case is Worcester. I know it's spelled Worcester, but it's pronounced Worcester, versus Georgia. And in this case, the people that are doing the lawsuit aren't Indians. They're white people, and the Supreme Court says, yes, you have standing, and yes, you're absolutely right. The state of Georgia has no authority over Indian reservations or Indian territory. Andrew Jackson doesn't like that ruling. Some people say he said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. I don't think he really said that. I think that was something the newspapers invented. Another quote that was supposedly made by him, the decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, and they find that they cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate. He gives orders to carry on with Indian removal, and there's some questionable contracts made, and eventually the Indians will be removed from Georgia in something we call the Trail of Tears. It actually involved the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Creeks. But it won't actually happen while Andrew Jackson is president. It'll happen after he's succeeded as president. Those are some of the trails. Seminoles are also involved. They're all moved out into what they call Indian Territory, which of course became a major portion of the state of Oklahoma. The last dispute. Man, we might run it and get done with all these disputes. I can't believe it. It's the National Bank dispute. The president wanted to do away with it. A lot of people didn't like the Bank of the United States. They thought it was a bank that only helped people who had lots of money. They thought the manager of the bank, remember the bank had trouble and they called in a guy to fix the bank, and when he got done, Nicholas Biddle takes over. And people thought he looked like an aristocrat. And people were afraid of the power and privilege that the bank had, and yet nobody in the government really couldn't control that bank. Nicholas Biddle used the money of the bank to preserve the bank. I mean, the fight starts in December of 1829. Jackson makes a speech. He doesn't do anything, but he speaks about getting rid of the bank. But Congress supported the bank in 1830. In 1830, in December of 1830, Jackson condemns the bank again, and his buddy from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton, is going to condemn the bank on the floor of the Senate. In 1831, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster decide to push the re-chartering of the bank. Remember, the charter expires in 1836. So remember that year. They want to renew the charter in 1832 because they want the president to veto their bank bill so he might lose the election in 1832. But he did get reelected. He did veto the bank bill. Then he got reelected. In 1833, Jackson is censured by the Congress, but in 1834, after a midterm election, the censure was lifted. And he's going to take some other measures. There's a cartoon about the bank veto there. That's Andrew Jackson with his famous walking cane, walking stick. Sometime along this, I'm trying to remember the date. Sometime along here, someone tried to kill Andrew Jackson. I'm trying to... I'll find out when we talk about it next time around. One person actually struck him, got away with that briefly, but another person tried to kill him. I wonder if I have it on, probably have it on another set of slides. Another person actually pulled out a gun, pulled the trigger, at almost point blank range. The gun didn't go off, so he pulled out a second pistol, pulled the trigger, and it didn't go off either. And the guess is that the weather was really humid and maybe the gunpowder was wet. Jackson almost beat the guy to death with his cane. In fact, people had to pull him away from the guy. They didn't want the president killing somebody. That wouldn't look good. Jackson thought that the bank concentrated too much money, too much of the U.S.'s financial strength in one place. And he also was afraid that the bank exposed us to foreign control. How is that? Well, the bank was essentially a private institution with government money in it. And anyone could invest in that bank, even foreigners. And there was some foreign ownership of the bank. We used to borrow a lot of money in England. There was some foreign ownership, but those people that invested in it didn't have voting positions in the bank. He also didn't like the bank because it tended to have too much influence over the members of Congress. And it's a known fact that the bank from time to time gave loans to congressmen who never paid them back. Sometimes very large loans. He thought the bank favored the northeastern states over the other states, and he thought that the bank just made rich people richer. It didn't help anyone else. Of course, the National Bank didn't tend to loan money to people. It loaned money to other banks. There was that election of 1832, and he didn't have any trouble in that election. He won almost twice as many votes as Henry Clay. One of the things he's going to do, beginning in October of 1833, is distribute the federal money that's in the bank. He's going to take it all out of the bank and distribute it to local state banks. They call them the pet banks. And the pet banks were all owned by Democrats, strangely enough. And there were some scandals in those banks. But all in all, he took all the federal funds out, and then he took steps to guarantee that the bank wouldn't get any more federal funds. Congress passed in June of 1836 the Distribution Act, which called for any treasury surplus to be put in the pet banks, not in the national bank. He also he issued the specie circular ordering the Secretary of the Treasury to only accept gold and silver specie for sales of public land over 320 acres after August of 1836. So it had to be paid for in hard money, except for people who were just buying a small piece of land, who were legitimately going to settle on the land. They weren't speculators. This bank war is going to end in the death of the National Bank. Economic disruption will happen, but it won't happen until Jackson's out of office in 1837. It also leads to a really, really strong two-party system. The two parties are now, they go by a different name now. The ones that were what we call National Republicans, the ones that just hated Andrew Jackson, the ones that didn't like Andrew Jackson because he belonged to the Freemasons. They all had their own little party fragments. Now they're going to become one party, and it's going to be called the Whig Party. And we'll talk about that and the fallout in Andrew Jackson's report card next class, and then we'll try and do a little bit of review for the exam. Thank you for your attention. Have an absolutely wonderful day. Pay attention to the notices I've been sending out. Hey, you guys, by the way, the nasty grams that I sent out, if the shoe fits, wear it, otherwise don't worry about it.